Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Rabbi Shalom. I'm the Dean for North America of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, and I'm also a rabbi in a humanistic Jewish congregation in suburban Chicago. This is a program sponsored by the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background into who we are and why this is a good place for Herb to be sharing his marvelous Hebrew and English Jewish poetry. Secular humanistic Judaism as an approach to Jewish life is a harmonization between a focus on this world, this life, the human experience, on one hand, and on the other hand, the historical, cultural, and emotional connections we have to Jewish culture and literature as our inheritance. We are not museum curators who have to treat our Jewish inheritance as something to be preserved exactly as it was. Rather, we are the heirs. We have inherited this. And so, as heirs do with their inheritance, we have to make our inheritance relevant and meaningful in our days and for our lives and values. We live in that borderland between the secular and the religious. We're philosophically secular in our focus on the natural world and the freedom of individuals and groups in their belief and practice. And yet we're still connected to the religious in our abiding attachment to Jewish rituals, asking deep questions, and a desire to connect with something beyond ourselves, even if it's not beyond the natural world that we can know, via history, via culture, or even connection to another person. A few years ago, I came across a beautiful poem in Hebrew and English that was in the magazine Jewish Currents, and it was by Herbert Levine. It articulated beautifully the creative challenges of secular Jewish expression that have gone back now over a century to labor Zionists and Jewish socialists and Yiddish diaspora nationalists. There are moments in life when we want to express joy or gratitude or pain, or to light Hanukkah candles, or to mark the spring with the Jewish festival of Passover. But we cannot squeeze our new ideas and beliefs and values into the old words and metaphors. Language addressing God, the commanding king, simply doesn't work for us. So what language does work? To put it shortly, instead of reciting, sometimes we write instead. Herbert Levine is the author now of 2 books of bilingual poetry, Words for Blessing the World in 2017, and An Added Soul, Poems for a New Old Religion, which will be out in the next week or so. He was educated at Harvard and Princeton, where he received a Ph.D. in English literature. And before turning to writing poetry, he was an English professor and also directed numerous nonprofit organizations working on issues of youth violence, diversity, and homelessness policy. I am so thrilled to have Herb Levine here with us. I would ask for a round of applause in an in-person event. So we'll just imagine people clapping for you, Herb. Wave your hands, that's right. And so we thought that a wonderful poem to open this program tonight would be the title poem from your first book, Words for Blessing the World, which is entitled, Blessed Are You, World. And so please, any opening thoughts you have, and then we'll have our first poem. Well,
it's just wonderful to be with you, Adam, and with the 60 plus folks that have joined us tonight, many of whom go back to time in my life that in which that intensive involvement in Hebrew was nurtured. So it's really special for me to have this occasion to do this with you. I guess, poets write sitting by themselves at a desk. I wrote these poems in Philadelphia and some of them in Costa Rica. And here I am writing in Philadelphia in Hebrew. I guess I want to just say that sometimes the Hebrew came first and sometimes the English came first. And we'll talk a little bit more about what was going on for me personally that led to these. But when I wrote this sequence of poems, and it's a 7-part sequence, this first poem, it wasn't necessarily in this order. They emerged, and then I shaped them into several movements in the hopes that they follow one another nicely. So I'll just, without further ado, I'll just begin with Blessed Are You, World. In the archives of Kibbutz Beit Hashita, I discovered forgotten handwritten notes for a Passover Seder from 1927. Instead of the Kaddish, the author wrote, "Blessed are you, Kibbutz." In his footsteps, I widen the blessing circle and say, "Blessed are you, world," to praise your fragile, complex beauty. 2. If you call the earth your mother who birthed you in pain from the wombs of the mothers from Eve until now, if you call the world your friend who upholds you whether in a day of trouble or of joy, if you call the universe your helpmeet who gives strength to both your weakness and your might, then join with me in these songs and we'll sing together in a world that fills our springs with blessings. 3. Planet orbiting the sun from time's beginning till its end. Planet blue, green, and white. Planet covered with water and land and sky. Planet made of forests, lakes and seas, fields and sandy beaches. Planet Earth that we have seen from space, complete and alive before our astonished eyes. 4. When I ask my friend how he's doing, he answers me, "Thank God." And he would respond thus even if he were suffering great distress. I think, but don't respond to him, "Thanks, earth from which I came at my birth. During my life, I have grown a sensitive soul, but I will return to the earth at my death without a soul and without pain, thanks to the embrace of the earth." 5. Like the enthusiastic kibbutznik who insisted on making his time new, let us make new what's old and make holy what's new and join what's called secular to what's called holy and what's called material to what's called spiritual until the gulf between them disappears. 6. They say that our life began through a crack in the ocean floor through which heat rose and still rises from the molten core of the earth and catalyzed the salty waters, giving birth to the amino acids, in them the history of life in the sea, on land, and in the air. The psalmist sings, "With you is the source of life. Every day I too acknowledge the source of life that still enlivens my breath." 7. From Einstein and his students, I learned that the elements in me were forged in the same furnace as the stars. From other great ones, I've learned to sit, breathe, pay attention with watchful eyes to a world filled with glory and wonders like me, like you, and like the stars. 8. Oh, blessed world, you give us each day visions and problems to solve and to praise.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, it's such a rich poem. There's so many details we could dive into to focus on. One theme that I found particularly resonant is your attention to science and your use of amino acids and cosmology and evolution as a source of inspiration. Carl Sagan, who was of Jewish background and also secular, once said, "We are star stuff that has taken its destiny into its own hands." You know, that connection to the cosmos and the Big Bang is in us and the heavy metals that are part of our life and keep our life possible. You know, people often think of science as dry and dull, and what you do by incorporating into the poem is really exciting and inspirational. It adds to the meaning of the poem. So tell me a little bit about why you decided to dive into the science part here. Is it sort of a parallel to creation, but the real story?
Well, exactly. I mean, the story in Genesis is a wonderful myth. It's a wonderful myth of bringing order out of chaos. And since then, Darwin has changed everything. And Darwin gave us a picture of the emergence of life that makes that idea of a creator God very difficult to sustain. And so in my quest for a poetry that would move toward prayer, that's, I guess, what my hope was in writing this, I realized that I needed to put it in language that could affirm what I know to be true. And so that language of our shared reality, of our shared truth, really is science. Of course, in our culture, science is unfortunately not a universal arbiter of truth. And so,
well, as they say, science doesn't care about your feelings.
Right,
It is or it isn't.
right. But so that's really where it came from. And you know, somebody critiqued me for putting Einstein in, a friend of mine, and he said, why? But you know, Einstein is the next great advance in which the whole of the universe begins to be comprehensible, not just biological life, but the whole of the cosmos and the laws of physics that govern it. So yeah, that's sort of a brief attempt to explain some of that.
Great. You know, I've also visited the Kibbutz Beit HaShita archive of ceremonies and life cycle events. It's really wonderful, inspirational, particularly for people who are looking for vocabulary of how to celebrate in a secular key. And one of the things I love about what you did with this poem is what the kibbutznik did too. It's sort of admitting the artifice here. When you say you to a kibbutz or you to the world, you don't really expect the world is listening, or that the world is going to do anything, or that the world commanded us to thank it, or that it will change its course if we ask really nicely.
Right.
It's saying, I know this is going nowhere. I know this is expressing what I feel, more importantly than it's hitting a target or addressing a personality.
I guess what I want to say is that the dialogic is crucial to what we learn about prayer. From prayer, we learn that we need to praise, we need to wonder and be in awe. We need to take responsibility. All those things are things that happen through prayer. But the other thing is we need to be in a dialogue. And right, so the world is not listening to me, but I feel that by saying you to the world, I'm elevating the concept of world so that it too can be sacred, just as in the past we elevated a God outside of the world to be sacred.
Right.
So, because I think if we're going to save this planet, we need to think of the world as sacred.
Interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your background? Someone asked in the chat, are you going to read some of the poems in Hebrew? And in fact, we are. Our next poem will be one that's in both languages. But maybe tell me a little bit about your background personally that sort of laid the groundwork or planted the seeds for doing this bilingual poetry.
My parents were both Hebrew speakers. My mother went to a Zionist Hebrew school in Lithuania and came to Boston and went to the Hebrew Teachers College, and she met my father there. And so Hebrew was the language of their love affair with one another. And you know, they met at age 12, married at age 23, but they had 11 years of studying Hebrew together. And so my brother and I, my brother's on the webinar, you know, we would on Friday nights, it didn't embarrass me, but looking back, it might have. They would sing love poems to one another, you know, like a Bialik poem that was part of their courtship, and it was there as part of the discourse of our Friday night ritual. So I went to a Hebrew-speaking summer camp for 6 years, and so I was really quite fluent as a young person, or at least, if not fluent, then proficient. And these poems started to emerge in Hebrew at the time that my mom passed away, and she was the last sort of piece of that legacy. And I'm sure there's a piece of reverence for what I got from her that is part of the mission of writing in Hebrew. The other thing is we grew up with this idea that Hebrew was the worldwide Jewish language, and that if you want something to get on the Jewish shelf, if you want it to be paid attention to by the future, then it needed to be in Hebrew as well as whatever other language. So this is the Torah that was written by human beings over many generations, that Ezra put before the people of Israel in the name of Moses, that Hillel the elder summarized hundreds of years after Ezra. What is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. The rest is commentary that's worth studying. And afterwards, do what needs doing. Zot HaTorah shenichtava al yedei bnei Adam meshech dorot dorot, shesam Ezra lifnei bnei Yisrael b'shem Moshe, shesikem hazaken Hillel me'ot shanim achrei Ezra, ma shesanu alecha al ta'aseh lechavercha, v'hayeter perush shekedai lilmod, v'achar kach ta'aseh ma shetzarich. Our ancestors were right when they said that one mitzvah leads to another, and likewise a misdeed. This I know from the mistakes of my life. I don't believe in a commander, but the language of thou shalt reminds me that we inherited the mitzvot in order to be refined, like silver in the hands of the smith, like gold separated from its dross. Avotenu tzadku כשאמרו שמצווה גוררת מצווה ועבירה עבירה. את זה אני יודע משקיעות חיי. איני מאמין במצווה, אבל לשון ציווי מזכירה לי שהמצוות נמסרו לידינו לצרפנו, ככסף ביד הצורף, כזהב נבדל מבדילו. That last phrase in Hebrew evokes Havdalah. It's the same root as the term for Havdalah, which was a lovely discovery I made. That wasn't a word I knew. I had to look that up to find that one.
You know, there's an irony in this poem, of course, because you begin with a very traditional phrase, Zot HaTorah, but then it goes in a very different direction. You know, and the irony is that what you wrote there, Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, Reconstructionist rabbis, renewal rabbis, they all learn in rabbinical school, but it doesn't always appear in their Sunday schools or in their synagogue services when they take out the Torah. Instead, they say, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel from the mouth of God and by the hand of Moses. And so you've flipped that to a historical understanding of Ezra as the compiler in the name of Moses. And it's a very creative piece, but you said the quiet part out loud. You know, most people don't say that.
So that's part of the whole enterprise that I'm in, which is to write poems that pass the truth test. Write Jewish poems that pass the truth test, and which, I mean, this poem has been used in chavurot and in congregations to introduce the moment of Torah reading. So, I mean, it creates perhaps a cognitive dissonance, or, you know, when it's brought in that way, maybe it just opens a door to that conversation. So, I mean, that's been a happy discovery that some of these poems are used, not just in humanist contexts like your congregation, Adam, but in other more traditional contexts as well.
So one question from the audience is that when you read in Hebrew, your inflection is very Israeli. And does the Hebrew bring that out in you in a way that the English doesn't necessarily? Because your English is American English.
You know, it's way less Israeli than somebody who lived in Israel more than the 6 months that I've managed to live in Israel, right? So, but I am aware of trying to write in a Hebrew that is close to the spoken idiom. And So it's natural for me to, I may have overcorrected my pronunciation because we're recording this, to be more Israeli. But it's an interesting question. I have some poet friends that who are more in touch with changes in the language. And so I try out all my stuff on them to make sure that it passes muster.
Right.
Right.
One of the subtleties in the Hebrew is the difference between the mitzvah and the mitzvot, the commander and the commandments. And I've used similar language in my work. As a humanistic rabbi, we don't traffic in commandments. I can give you the 10 suggestions or the 10 recommendations, but a commandment often has a commander behind it. And some live as commanded by tradition or commanded by ancestry, but there are plenty of these commandments that we might reject or we might not consider as meeting our ethical standards today. But that idea of exploring the concept of mitzvah on multiple levels, in Yiddish and in American English, mitzvah has a sense of good deed, not just commandment.
Right.
And,
well, this whole idea of mitzvot exists in order to be refined is a rabbinic term that I borrowed. So I'm important, I've along the way in my life, I've studied lots of rabbinic, and Bible. So the poems are, suffused with that imagery, but always trying to update, always trying to contemporize.
Right. We had another one we were going to do in Hebrew and English for the new year. So
this begins referencing a line from the Yom Kippur evening prayers after Kol Nidre. There's a series of piyutim, of liturgical poems. And the liturgical poem is that our prayers go up in the evening and may they be received through the morning until the next evening. So I begin with this Erev and Boker. Me'erev ad Boker ad Erev ha'olam mistovev, ha'teva mishtaper, aval ma iti. Yesh harbe al ma levakesh slicha benihul olami, he'eder Eloha eno terutz. From evening till morning till evening, the world revolves. Nature self-corrects, but will I? There's much to atone for in how I manage my world. The absence of a God is no excuse. Ein din ve'ein dayan amar Kayin belibo, v'harag et achiv livdok et ta'anato. Kayin nish'al ayeka, gam ani bodek im ani kafuf o zakuf. No law nor judge, said Cain in his heart, and killed his brother to test his claim. Cain was asked, where are you? I too check whether I am bent or upright. Kasheli yotzon b'li ro'eh, amar David b'li bo, v'hitpalel le'eloha sheyinavet et darko. Liyatzer neshama hi avodah bodedet, ru'uya lero'eh tzon, ani hatzon hayichidi she'ani menahel. Difficult to be a sheep without a shepherd, David said in his heart, so prayed to a God to guide his walk. To forge a soul is lonely work, suitable for a shepherd. I am the only sheep that I can guide. Ne'emar she'Avraham bin Dudav nata eshel, v'sha'al oto harbe she'elot. Ani menaseh lichyot b'li ashlayot. Zot kol ha'yerusha she'ani manchil levanai. It is said that Abraham, during his wanderings, planted a tamarisk and asked it many questions. I try to live without illusions. That's all the legacy I leave my children. Before we leave this slide, I just want to say that this is one of the places where the gift of writing in Hebrew was so much greater than in English. The word tamarisk in Hebrew is eshel, which is the same letters as sha'al, in a different order, the same letters as the word to ask. And so this idea is already a midrashic pun that the ashel tree, you could ask it questions. And then it turns out that modern Hebrew invented the word ashlaya with two of the same letters, but the same sounds for illusion. So it was just this fusion happening on so many levels at once that was just thrilling to discover. So I like the poems better in Hebrew. They're richer to me, but you know, there are plenty where the illusions work in English as well.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thanks for pointing that out. I love that Hebrew can do that with the word roots in ways that English does not. It's one thing I try to teach even to my 7th grade students, to get a flavor for how sefer and sifriya and sofer and how the layers of language work. That in English we have to dream a dream and maybe to lug luggage, and that's about it when we do that in the same way. One of the things I love about this poem, particularly looking at the new year, is that it's both traditional and transgressive at the same time. You know, we know that even in traditional sources, you're supposed to seek forgiveness from the person you've wronged before you can seek divine forgiveness. That's basic, you know, atonement. And in our movement in Humanistic Judaism historically, and in secular Jewish communities even before we existed, the focus was not on supernatural forgiveness, it was on forgiving each other, but also the psychologist's lesson of learning to forgive yourself. An inward focused atonement forgiveness process instead of above and beyond. Again, the focus is shifted to the human realm. And I love that metaphor you used about what it's like being a shepherd, a sheep without a shepherd, having to be our own shepherd, so to speak. And it could be the existentialist dread, but it's also the humanist sort of inspirational opportunity and the contemplative responding to reality in ways that create meaning.
Thank you for that. You know, obviously, Shepherd always will bring up Psalm 23, and in another poem in this new book, it was my bubby's favorite poem and favorite psalm, so I refer to it in another place. And I myself wrote a book on psalms, so the psalm language is, you know, very much part of my vocabulary. But like, it's the same as that what you noticed about I preserve mitzvah without the commander. So I preserve the metaphor of the sheep without the shepherd. And there is a feeling of, there's a little bit of a feeling of being bereft. You know, it isn't, but it's a bereftness that one can accept and work with. You know, you don't have to just say, well, so as not to feel bereft, I'll just stay with the tradition. And
well, and secular people can be tempted into authoritarian practice and lifestyle too. You know, that having someone tell you what to do and what to wear and what to eat, you know, is tempting. But
right.
Sometimes the rewards of freedom are worth the difficulties of making those choices for yourself. So I'm curious for this shift in direction, because in your epilogue to the first book, you talk a little bit about the evolution of your thought and your practice and how you've evolved toward this more sort of secularized but still spiritual expression. I know there's another poem that we were going to read next about your father's approach to death. And actually, I remembered you cite 23rd Psalm in that one as well.
Oh, yes, yes.
But maybe you want to talk a little bit about your sort of evolution in thought and writing and direction, and then we'll move to that next poem.
Well, so I mentioned my mother earlier, giving rise to poems in Hebrew, and my father died 5 years earlier. That gave rise to poems as well, to a kind of torrent of writing, autobiographical writing, and trying to evoke his larger than life presence through my writing. And some of that was prompted by the experience of saying Kaddish. And this poem that I'm going to read next is about my brother and my both saying Kaddish for different reasons and having it do different things for each of us, and in the sort of emotional economy of our our family. So I think I will read that, and then it will be clearer the next thing you might want to say about it. This poem is called As Our Father Neared Death. As our father neared death, his mind raced between fantasies and the facts of his life, his speech like the black box of an airplane that had crashed, the record of its journey jumbled beyond reconstruction. My brother and I cared for him, sometimes feeding, sometimes reading to him from the book of Psalms. I led him beside green pastures and still waters, when he, in a soft voice, as if from far away, blessed me. May God bless you and keep you. May God shine his face upon you until its end. Am I not the brother who wrapped himself in a talit, who stood before the congregation on Shabbat and holidays to lead it in prayer to an improbable God? But all that ritual razzmatazz fooled my fond old man and me. After his death, my brother came every Shabbat and holiday to say Kaddish with our mother. She said to me every Sunday when I visited her, your father would be so happy that your brother is saying Kaddish for him. Thus, my brother received her blessing for the great kindness he did her, a kindness that only the living can receive. I don't know how many other people, for how many other people this is true, but my father's death got me to reevaluate my connection to traditional religious Judaism. And I got to realize at some level that what I was doing, I had been doing for him to win his approval, to make sure that one of the children was would be approved of in that way. In fact, the first poem I published was an Esau poem in the voice of Esau, because I realized that in my mind I had this sibling rivalry with my brother that was reflected in the Esau-Jacob struggle. It wasn't my brother's issue at all. He was the older brother. He couldn't have cared less, probably. But but it was in my consciousness, and that this death broke it open. It liberated me to see him anew, and he turned out to be, in this poem, as we see, the dutiful son, the good son who Jacob, goes with his mother every Shabbat to say Kaddish. And it just, at that point, all bets were off. I was just ready to explore where my mind was going to go. And then the other shoe dropped after my mother died, and that gave rise to these poems.
You know, I find it an interesting experience. I do funerals for families all the time, some of whom are not members of our community. And there's always 3 or 4 options for what to do at the end of the service. You could pick a modern poem that people are used to hearing, like in the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember him, that I think Rabbi Jack Reimer wrote many years ago. Or Leah Goldberg poetry. She has a beautiful poem about the beginnings of things that works well. Some people want the traditional Kaddish, to recite it because it's traditional and it's what their parent would have wanted, it's what they're familiar with. Some are open to doing a humanistic adaptation of a Kaddish that praises Shlomo ba'alma, peace in the world, instead of the great name. And so then it's shifting is to talking about peace, the peace that the one who has died has found. We say peace upon him, right? Shalom alav. And some like that, and some don't like the idea of changing that text.
Right.
It's too canonical the way it is, and it'd be like singing I bless America. It would just
right. No, I hear you.
Wouldn't feel it.
In the new book, there is a poem called A New Kaddish, and we're not going to read it tonight. I have to give people some reason to buy the new book. But it does take the name Shmei Rabbah and give it a new twist that I can get behind.
Look, you could have said in your case, Shmei Abba.
Right. But this is much bigger. It gets cosmic. So, and I owe that idea to Rabbi Arthur Waskow. So,
but that's one of the challenges people find, though, when they actually understand what they're saying. That was, people thought was the big problem the Catholic Church made in the 60s when they translated the Mass into English or the vernacular languages, because then people knew what they were saying. When it was in Latin, they could at least, pretend.
They could ignore it.
And the more you know what it means, sometimes the harder it is to keep reciting those words that you wouldn't say in English. So for some people, the death of a parent pushes them into a more traditional practice. For others, it is the opportunity to reevaluate and decide what's most important to them and how can they say what they feel in the words that they would choose for themselves and not what the past said. So I wanted to use that to open up a conversation about poetry itself. You're writing in poetry, you're not writing prose essays or op-ed pieces. Why poetry? Why do you find poetry to be such a powerful medium to express what you want to express?
I think that the conciseness that one goes for in a poem allows for saying things in a memorable way, in a way that will be condensed and able to be held on to. And I don't think poets say things that haven't been thought before, but I think they get, if they're lucky and they work at it, they hone their skill at saying them memorably. And I think that that's something that I'm working at. Then I think the other thing is just there's music. The music of the rhythm of the language is something that has always communicated itself to me. I've always, since the first time a teacher said, go explore poems and come back with some poet you like, I've loved poetry. So,
well, and that's another Hebrew connection, because in Hebrew, the same word for poem is the word for song.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And I call this next poem a song for gratitude. This is most people's favorite of mine. What does it take to treasure each day, to give thanks for the gifts not earned, to savor the taste of every first fruit, and know that enough is as good as a feast? It takes a lifetime to learn how to live, to sort through the stuff that fills up our days, to weigh and measure just what to claim, and know that enough is as good as a feast. So sit at nightfall with those you love and light a candle to greet the dark. Clasp hands as you bless the bread and know that enough is as good as a feast. Open your heart to the joy and the pain, the bitter and sweet of the knowledge you've gained, and sweetly surrender to what you can't change, and know that enough is as good as a feast.
So many resonances in there, even to Naomi Shemer music. This is in the first book. It's I think one of the last poems in the book, because you have Lamar Ulamatok, which is that.
That was in my. It was in my head. It was definitely in my head, especially because I was writing in Hebrew and English, and the whole ceremony of saying the motzi is in the poem. It turns out that I didn't make up this phrase, enough is as good as a feast. It's a phrase that I found by listening to La Morte d'Arthur by Mallory, a 15th century romance in English, somewhere between Chaucer's English and Shakespeare's English. And then it turns out Henry James borrowed it in some work of his. So,
but they were both stealing from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said, "Mihu ashir hamisameach bechelko," who is rich, the one who is happy with his portion.
There you go.
They're all derivative anyways.
Thank you. Thank you.
The other thing I love about this poem is that it can be equally meaningful no matter how religious or secular you are, because it doesn't say what you have to say when you're blessing the bread, or what, you're lighting a candle to greet the dark. That could be for any purpose, not just from a sense of commandedness. And so that's, I think, also getting at one of the things that poetry does beautifully well, and your poetry does, I think, very well, is getting that universal experience, that emotional affect of gratefulness, of gratitude that we want to express, even if we don't have a personality that we want to point it towards.
Right. It's central. It's central to my daily practice. I make a list of things I'm grateful for every morning that has to do with who I'm going to see that day. It's part of my spiritual practice. That poem in particular brings the framework of ritual into a secular utterance. Which I'm just saying, in other words, what you just said.
Right. Well, people think sometimes that secular people are cold, emotionless. We talked about science, but also that they don't have those feelings of gratitude or awe or wonder. And we do. We just don't need a personality to direct them towards. The world itself sometimes is awesome and wonderful in its own way. And that gratitude can be expressed first to the people who do these things, but secondly, to the fact that they happen. Is you can express the gratitude without it being directed.
We just got a question. Poets often have the candle fight against the dark. Why or how does your candle greet the dark? Yeah, I think that it's about embracing all of life, the poem, the light and the dark, the bitter and the sweet. And so greeting the dark is an embrace. Yeah.
Right? Or acceptance of reality. Again,
acceptance.
It's going to be dark outside no matter how many candles you light.
Yeah, exactly. And you see the dark better, actually, if you light a candle.
Right. That's right. Well, so one other question that we had talked about in preparing for this program is, why Jewish poetry? There are human experiences of gratitude in other settings, and certainly plenty of poets who've written in English on all kinds of emotional experience, but you've pitched this as Jewish poetry in the choice of language, obviously, but also the choice of reference and content and direction.
My choice of the publisher. The
publisher helps too.
The publisher chose me.
So I guess my question is, why write Jewish poetry? And in particular, how does Jewish poetry function as a kind of doing Jewish, a kind of alternate Jewish practice, whether in the writing for you or in the reading for the audience?
It's really interesting. In putting together both books of poetry, and in many ways they're one big book. I wanted to create my own version of all of Judaism, which is to say, I wanted to have my say about creation. I wanted to have my say about revelation. In the next poem we're going to read, I wanted to have my say about redemption. That I've had this very intensive Jewish education in my life, and I wanted to have my say about Israel. And so many of the poems allow me to be in conversation with the great Jewish ideas and practices of the past. And I think of Judaism as a conversation. And I have not thought about what you just said, that it's a way of doing Jewish. But I like that idea. Why certain poems come to me in English and others in Hebrew, we were just asked. And this next one definitely begins in Hebrew, and it has to do with echoes in my head of lines that are floating around. That a poem begins with a line or a few words, and this one begins with Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, which is something we sang at camp, especially on Tisha B'Av. And it was So then I've got this line in my head, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with perfect faith. Well, what is it that I believe with perfect faith? So I need to write my own version because I don't believe in what the tradition told me to believe in with perfect faith. So here is this very brief poem, I believe with perfect faith. I believe with perfect faith that the Jews came out of Egypt to testify that there are narrow straits in every place that all of us must pass through to march toward a promised land that we will not reach, but which will never disappear from our eyes. So it contains that messianic yearning, and it recognizes that our experience with false messiahs has not been so positive. We're not going to, no Messiah can come to Jews and have Jews accept that person because, you know, it just would be so un-Jewish to do so.
Well, except for the Lubavitchers.
Some Lubavitchers have done it, but I think that's going to fade away in time. And
yeah, just like that Jesus sect. That's a passing phase.
Well, the Jesus thing didn't pass away. Yeah.
You know, that line on Ima Amin appears in other poetry too. It's a famous Shaul Chernikovsky poem. It begins Anima Amin. He doesn't say Be'emunah Shlema, but it starts with that same phrase that Maimonides coined in his 13 Principles of Faith.
Right.
But in Chernikovsky's version, he says Ani Ma'amin Ba'adam. I believe in humanity. In fact, a line of that poem appears on Israeli currency today. You got, I think it's either the 20 shekel or the 10 shekel note.
Interesting. Well, so he was doing, I mean, I'm in Chernikovsky's tradition in that case. You know, well, he was trying to find what he could put behind Anima Amin. And
right. And Yehuda Amichai does the same. And I know that he's an influence as well. We're going to talk about. He says in one of his poems, I say with perfect faith that prayers precede God. Prayers created God, that created man, who creates prayers. And it's a cycle. You know, it's hard to.
Well, no, I think man created God, who creates. Man created
the prayers, and the prayers create God.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's the emotional experience that comes first, and then the address, you know, the direction goes somewhere else.
Well, you bring up Yehuda Amichai. In the 1980s, Yehuda Amichai began publishing bilingual volumes. He had very wonderful English translators, and I bought those bilingual volumes. I don't know, you know, they must have been reviewed in the New York Times. I learned about them, and that is what really opened me up to discover that I could go back to the Hebrew of my youth and develop it. And it's by reading Amichai and others that I got sort of good at Hebrew again, if you will. And he succeeded in writing in this very ordinary idiom, but with tremendous resonance for the past. He grew up as an Orthodox Jew. The Siddur is echoing in his head always. The Bible is echoing in his head. Unlike the generation of Bialik and Chernikovsky, who wanted to be prophets, he lived on, or he walked down the street of the prophets, and you know, and said, "Here I am walking down the street of the prophets." And he by doing that, he creates a sort of ironic juxtaposition of himself and the past. I'm now somebody who lives in a country that has a street of the prophets, and I know that my utterances, you know, they're not backed up. They're not coming from that thus spoke in the name of God, you know. So something about his irony was so endearing. And then I met him, of course, he's just a wonderful human being. In his last book that you referenced in one of our conversations, Open, Closed, Open, Patuach, Sagur, Patuach, He has a line that he repeats at least 6 times. This too is the beginning of a new religion, which came from a much earlier poem that you quoted to me once. An Arab shepherd is looking for his goat and meets the poet, and he says, "This is often the beginning of a new religion." So I wrote this poem with Amichai in mind. I called it a new religion just this week, since I wrote the subtitle of the book that's coming out. I'm now calling this poem a new old religion. Dat Chadasha no Shana. A new old religion, without gods and holy worship and commandments engraved in stone, without ecstatic dances, without prophets and crazy riddles. At its center, how Ruth followed Naomi out of love, how Boaz opened his hand and his heart to Naomi and Ruth, how he gave them 6 overflowing measures of barley, how he prevented his young men from harassing the attractive stranger, how he bought an unneeded field to heal a broken Naomi. The lion will not lie down with the lamb. With kindness, the world to come can come now.
Yeah. You know, in the classic tradition of longtime married spouses sharing a brain, you actually answered Ellen's question in the Q&A. How do you avoid hubris if we regard the natural world as the pinnacle of creation, as the only thing that strikes awe in us? And I think this poem is talking about an ethos of a human-focused approach to religion, this old new religion or new old religion, that's focused on generosity, on caring, on giving, and on serving others. So the humility comes from our status as a member of the human family, and as a contributing member to that family, rather than assuming the world was made for me, you know.
Right. That's beautifully said. One of my rabbis, Irish Stone, defines Yirat Hashem, the awe of God, as the awe that we must carry around at the extent of what's before us to serve others, the extent of the burden of others that's available to us to share in by listening, by helping to relieve sorrow. So a lot of my poems stress kindness as the answer, if you will, to life's conundrums.
We do have a request if you can read the Old New Religion in Hebrew as well. Is that something you want to do?
Sure.
Okay.
And while we're waiting, do you have any other observation to make?
Well, I thought about this poem in particular as another Amichai echo, because one of his most powerful poems for me is often called Roshi Roshi, my head, where he imagines that he banged his head on the door, and
I love that
the person
poem.
he's with comforts him. He doesn't see visions of hands stroking heads in the opening heavens or a world where there were no doors anymore. He does what he needs to comfort himself. There's his subjective experience, there's the harsh reality of the world, and there's the comfort of another person's hand. Yadech, yadech, your hand, your hand. And it's really all that we understand and what we need, but it's again focused on the human realm and not the above and beyond and the next world. Again, the world to come should be here. And that is, again, a secular and humanistic message of action and obligation.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. And here it is in Hebrew. Dat Chadasha no Shana. Dat Chadasha no Shana. Bli Elohim upulchan kadosh. Umitzvot charutim al aven. Bli rikudim nilhavim. Bli nevi'im v'chidot meshugaot. Bemerkaza ech Ruth halcha acharei Naomi bechemla. איך בועז פתח את ידו וליבו לנעמי ולרות, שנתן להן 6 מנות שעורה שופעות, שמנע מנעריו להציק לזרע המושכת, שקנה שדה בלתי נחוץ כדי לרפא את נעמי השבורה. האריה לא ישכב עם הכבש, בחסד העולם הבא יכול לבוא עכשיו.
Great. So we're entering Hanukkah season, and those holidays and the stories around the holidays provide particular challenges for secular Jews. In fact, if we had lived back in the days of the Maccabees, we might have been much more inclined to be a Hellenizing Jew, open to learning Greek wisdom and going to the gymnasium, rather than the fanatic pietist Maccabees, who, as one example, conquered a neighboring people and forcibly converted and circumcised them. You know, these are not our people when we think about it in a modern liberal context.
They were jihadists.
Well, okay.
In short.
Right. They were in a holy war. And the first casualty of the Maccabean rebellion was a Jew who was willing to sacrifice on the Greek altar. So you have this
I've had that thought for a long time, and it led to this next poem. I call it Musings of a Jewish Hellenist on Hanukkah. And it has 2 stanzas. The first stanza is in quotation marks. The second stanza is not. When I spoke up at a parent meeting in favor of teaching our children Greek, they mocked me. Sure, we can teach them Greek when you find a time that is neither night nor day, because night and day we are absorbed in our Torah. When I showed them how the Septuagint improves upon the ancient garbled Hebrew, they called for a fast to lament the desecration. Now I sit and watch the tiny candles burning in my deep diaspora, competing with their small light against the giant blaze of Christmas, and feel grateful for a festival of small lights, because only from small deeds, giving a soft answer, turning away anger, increasing peace at home, is the world sustained.
I find that the Maccabees exemplified the dilemma we have as modern Jews between Jewish values and our values, and the times they overlap and the times they don't. It's more like a Venn diagram than simultaneous circles, you know, because there are historic Jewish values that many of us don't connect with, that are articulated.
So the value of kindness, and we got a question in the chat. Why did I pick the story of Ruth as the centerpiece of the new old religion? It's my favorite book in the Bible because it's just about kindness. It reverses an old prejudice against Moabites. The Torah was not happy with Moabites.
To put it mildly.
Legendarily, they came out of an incestuous union of Lot and his daughters. One of the daughters. They hadn't, according to the story, been welcoming to the Jews leaving Egypt who wanted to go through their land. So the Torah, proscribes them for generations. And here comes this late book that takes that Jewish hardness, that rigidity that's like the rigidity of the Maccabees that you're talking about, and it just opens it up. The Moabite heroine becomes a Jew. She becomes the ancestor of the Messiah, by the future Messiah that we'll never acknowledge, from the line of David. So anyway, that's why it serves that function for me. It
also makes the point that good values can be universal. Jews don't have a monopoly on kindness, on generosity, on gratitude. And so sometimes we learn from the vocabulary of other cultures too. That's the musing of a Jewish Hellenist. At one point, the Talmud said, do not teach your kids Greek wisdom. It's dangerous.
Right.
and dangerous to Jewish unity, let alone to yourself.
Right.
And nowadays we learn from philosophy, from other people's, as well as we learn from our own cultural values.
Well, we just have to think about the righteous Gentiles and all the people who were saved during the Holocaust to know that we don't have a monopoly on kindness.
So I thought this would be a good entree to switch directions a little bit, because
Okay.
your new poetry includes meditations on diaspora-ness and rootedness in Israel. And again, writing in both languages, you sort of have a foot in both worlds. And so we did talk about doing a poem called Diaspora Hymn, although the Hebrew title actually is Mizmor, which is more commonly used as psalm, but also has that root of zemer, melody in it, just like we talked about with poetry and singing.
Right. So this is a poem that came out of a workshop. I was at a workshop on diversity in the Jewish world. This is what I wrote. Diaspora Hymn. From across the sea, they brought their heavy utensils, the brass mortar and pestle, reminding them of familiar spices, cinnamon, cloves, and also chopped nuts, could not abide again being strangers, expected nothing from these Gentiles among whom they peddled to earn their living, would never trust them, never believe that one day their great-grandchildren would marry them, invite them to chop nuts in Bubby's mortar and pestle, light holiday candles with them, and walk with them out of Egypt, opening wide their doors to love. It was published this fall in Poetica, a journal of Jewish poetry, and when it did, I put it on Facebook and dedicated it to my daughter-in-law, Liz, with whom we do seders, and this whole business of making charoset with the great-grandchildren of the people who had the mortar and pestle, making charoset in it was a very it's a very real image for me of what has become possible.
Well, it's the power of material culture. It's the power of food as identity connection.
Right.
And also, I love the fact that this is a poem that's so intermarriage affirmative and inclusive. We talked earlier about doing Jewish. That's exactly what's happening in that poem. They're grinding the nuts, they're making the food, they're celebrating the holidays. Whether they are Jewish or not in their personal identity is in some ways almost irrelevant to the fact that they're with us and they're celebrating our holidays together as a family and loving us. That's what's important. And we get so caught up sometimes on the question of who is and isn't by identity and who's allowed to do what. And sometimes it's better to just break down those barriers and be open to the openness that has included us.
Right. I think that's a poem that will have legs, that there's a lot of intermarried folks who need a poem such as that.
The other thing I loved was your phrasing in the Hebrew. Again, you use the word tufutzot as opposed to the word galut. Again, it has a different resonance in the Hebrew. Galut is exile. It means you're not where you belong. But tefutza, or a diaspora, going back to the Greek, if we dare do so in Hanukkah season, is the spreading of seeds like spores. And it's a much more organic, rooted, natural process. We know from biology that wheat tastes different when it's grown in different soil and different sun and different water. And so the seeds of diaspora likewise will grow differently in Persia, in Afghanistan, in North Africa, and in Europe and in America. And part of that is also the cross-fertilization that they get in those areas, whether it's admitted or not. There's a reason why all the Jews look different in all the different parts of the diaspora, and it wasn't from the food, and it wasn't from the air and the water. From the people.
I hear you.
So I thought a good closing poem, again, one of my favorites out of the anthology, and this is, again, in the first book, Words for Blessing the World, An Added Soul is coming out in the next week, perfect time for Hanukkah, is the poem right near the beginning called Don't Say There Is No Prayer, which has been...
Don't think there is no prayer.
I'm sorry, don't think there is no prayer, which has been our message in Humanistic Judaism for years, that you can have community, you can have expressing the deep longings of the soul. We might not use the vocabulary of prayer as often as we use celebration, meditation, and other language, but I think we may have to rethink that with what you've done here with the concept of prayer. And so I'd be really interested in having you close us out with this, this wonderful poem, Don't Think There Is No Prayer.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is in several parts as well. This is in 5 parts. And I should just say that the last part, I have written my own melody to, and it's my daily prayer. 1, don't think there is no prayer in a world without a master. In Hebrew, to pray is a reflexive verb. You need only yourself, the I that fears, makes people mad and complains, and the I that includes all the eyes in the world and asks that you have compassion on yourself and on them all. 2, just as the lad Abram put a hammer in the hand of the biggest idol in his father's workshop and pointed to it as the one who shattered all the rest, so our father Abraham put that self-same hammer in our hands so that we might destroy images of God, which since then have screened us from seeing that there is nothing holier than the world. Everyone carries a sack on his or her shoulder full of the emotional wounds that one suffers during his or her life. But those who are healthy seek to lighten the load of memories. The Jewish God also carries a giant sack on his shoulder and is bent over by the weighty disappointments of the Jews that he did not honor his promises to them. He too wants to be healthy, so he prays to his children. The burden of your hopes and disappointments is too heavy for me to bear. Please, my children, let me put down my sack. Stop believing in me. 4, every Rosh Hashanah during my childhood, my father would ask my bubby, why are the corners of your prayer book's pages folded over? Every year she answered him, this is where we cry. From her life of wandering, my bubby understood tears and their consequences. In no way challenge fate by failing to mention the one who watches over all, but hope with the help of God and be grateful with praise God and thank God. I also want to express hopes and give thanks for the good in my life and be amazed by the wonders of the universe. With the help of the world, my tongue is getting used to new expressions. 5, this is my prayer and my path in life, to betroth the world in its fullness, to serve others in joy, to act towards them in love and truth, to trust that right living and peace will bloom. Zot tfilati v'derech chayai, lihitares im ha'olam hamalei, la'avod acherim b'simcha, lihitnaheg imam b'chesed uve'emet, v'livtoach shetzedek v'shalom yifrachu.
I think you've enacted a challenge that Yehuda Amichai set in one of his more beautiful poems, where he describes having a fragment of a tombstone on his desk that says simply Amen, one word. And he says at the end of that poem, gods in the sky change, gods come and go, but prayers remain forever. And I think in your poetry, in your expression of the human experience and your own Jewish experience, in the Jewish experiences you've created by people being able to hear and read your poetry, I think you've done a wonderful service in continuing that legacy of dialogue with the past, but on our own terms and with honesty and integrity. So Herb, I want to thank you very much for what you've put together in these 2 volumes of poetry and the doors you've opened, hopefully, for many people to experience their Jewishness in new vocabulary and with new emotional resonance.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Adam. This has been just a thrill, the thrill of a lifetime. So I'm very glad that we found each other, and I look forward to learning from you again in the future.
And now we just have to come up with a new term for a paitan who's secular. A pious poem that isn't so pious. We'll do our best. Thanks all again to all of our attendees who've come. Thanks for the great questions and chat comments. Really added to the program. And hope you all have a good evening. Please stay safe and have a warm Hanukkah as well.